This is the brand new Vivo X200 Ultra, and this is the Samsung S25 Ultra. In this video, we're going to compare the photo and video capabilities of these two top flagship camera phones on the market. Alright friends, let's get started.
Hey friends, this video was translated using a neural network, so the sound quality isn't the best. If you want to listen to the original sound from a smartphone and hear the audio recording test, just follow the link in the description to our original video. By the way, friends, we're in Lauterbrunnen, one of the most picturesque corners of Switzerland. A narrow valley, little villages, mountains all around, and 72 waterfalls.
Friends, as usual, our first test is 4K at 60 frames per second, front-facing camera. Both smartphones. I'm in an absolutely gorgeous country, very beautiful, called Switzerland.
The first thing that stands out when shooting in good lighting is the significant difference in color reproduction. With Vivo, the whole image has a yellowish tint, it's quite bright, and the skin tone ends up looking orange. With Samsung, we see a more accurate white balance and a more natural skin color. I'll also note that the video on the left looks less detailed. For example, wrinkles on the forehead, hair, and the texture of clothing look more blurred with Vivo than in the image on the right. There's another difference. The Vivo front camera has a slight optical blur, while on the Samsung, the entire frame is in focus. When shooting against the light, Vivo has issues with shadows. They appear quite bright, which makes the image lack contrast. With the Samsung, the image looks darker, but at the same time it's more contrasty, which is more visually appealing. When it comes to stabilization, Vivo's front cameras have always had issues, and unfortunately, we see background shake here as well, while in the video on the right, the image is more stable.
Friends, this is what video portrait shooting looks like on the Vivo X200 Ultra. Unfortunately, we can only shoot in full HD. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, I'm shooting in 4K. Both are at 30 frames per second. And this is what the picture looks like when filming myself with good lighting, meaning when the lighting is directly on me. This is what the picture looks like for us. But honestly, it's raining. I don't know if it's getting on the lenses.
Unfortunately, a raindrop did get on the Samsung's lens, but that's not a problem for us. What can I say here? Of course, Vivo immediately gets a small minus for having a full HD image on an Ultra flagship. Guys, how is that even possible? That's just not serious for 2025. But at the same time, the background blur works smoothly on both smartphones, even when my hand flashes in the frame. When it comes to color correction and well-lit shooting, the difference remains. In terms of quality, once again, the video on the right looks more confident and refined, so I won't repeat myself too much here. When shooting against the light, it's noticeable that Vivo actively brightens the face, but the skin ends up looking pretty smoothed out and overexposed. With Samsung, the face turns out quite dark, but it's more detailed and without any overexposure. As for stabilization, once again the S25 Ultra performed more smoothly, while on the left we see shaking again. By the way, what about the technical specs? The X200 Ultra has a front camera with 50 megapixels, an f2.45 aperture, and a sensor size of 1/2.76 inches. It has autofocus. The Samsung S25 Ultra is equipped with a 12 megapixel module with an f2.2 aperture, a 1/3.2 inch sensor, and dual pixel phase autofocus.
This is what our filming setup looks like. If you shoot with an ultra-wide-angle lens, shooting 4K 60 frames per second, we're filming everything around us.
When shooting everything around with the ultra-wide lens, you can notice a difference in image detail. If you look at the grass, trees, and rocks, they appear sharper and more detailed on the Vivo than on the Samsung. However, I should note that the Samsung clearly has a wider field of view with its ultra-wide lens. As for stabilization, both smartphones performed almost identically, so let's move on.
The Vivo X200 Ultra also has an ultra-wide mode, so you activate the feature there, and the image becomes super wide.
When you turn on the ultra-wide angle, in theory, digital stabilization is disabled on the Vivo, which is usually what causes a slight crop of the image, and as a result, we get a wider field of view. And here, you can really see with the naked eye that the coverage on the left side of the image is slightly wider than on the right. And by the way, I can't say that stabilization on the X200 Ultra got any worse. We see a result that's quite comparable to Samsung.
Right now I've turned off the super ultra wide angle on the Vivo X200 Ultra. Now the angle has become a bit narrower. I didn't change anything on the Samsung, 4K 60 frames per second on both smartphones.
When filming yourself with the ultra-wide, Vivo actually achieves a more accurate white balance, while Samsung shifts the image toward an orange tint, including the skin tone. Vivo's skin tone also looks a bit yellowish, but the color isn't as saturated as in the video on the right. While jogging, background shake is noticeable on both smartphones, but with Samsung there's also some blur that you don't see on the Vivo.
Friends, this is what filming with the ultra-wide-angle lens looks like. If I set an even wider angle on the Vivo X200 Ultra, you get the maximum expansion. But as a result, the stabilization should, in theory, get worse. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, I just have the ultra-wide angle, 0.6x.
The effect of the wider angle when filming yourself is actually even more noticeable than when filming everything around you. Here, it's clear that Vivo provides a more immersive field of view than Samsung. At the same time, Vivo once again delivers higher image quality. For example, if you look at the hood strings, on the left, you can see the fabric texture, while on the right, it's blurred. As for color reproduction when shooting with the light, there isn't much of a noticeable difference. When shooting against the light, Vivo once again brightens the foreground more aggressively. But unfortunately, in this case, it didn't help at all. The face looks dark on both the left and the right. But I should note that the sky is clearly visible on both smartphones. At least it's not blown out. When I lower the smartphones, we once again get different results in terms of color and quality. Samsung makes the image very saturated, which you can see in the skin tones and the greenery, and once again shifts the hues toward yellow. With Vivo, the result here looks softer and more neutral. In the stabilization test, once again, in the video on the right, you can see blur with every step. With the X200 Ultra, there aren't any noticeable changes in stabilization.
On the Vivo, I cropped the ultra-wide-angle lens and I'm shooting at 1x zoom.
Guys, it's really important to mention here that 1x on the Vivo is actually a digital crop from the ultra-wide lens, while on the Samsung it's already using the main lens. On the X200 Ultra, the main lens only activates at 1.5x zoom. Now I've set the same zoom levels for a fair comparison. And of course, the video on the left looks pretty weak, blurry, and also loses out in the stabilization test. So, I definitely wouldn't recommend using this zoom level on the Vivo.
And this is what filming looks like if you shoot at 1.5x zoom on the Vivo X200 Ultra and 1x on the Samsung S25 Ultra.
When shooting everything around you with the main lenses, the image turns out pretty similar, with only a slight difference in color reproduction. The video from the Vivo is warmer, while the Samsung's is cooler and more saturated. What about stabilization? The video on the left looks less stable, with noticeable side-to-side shaking, whereas the one on the right appears much smoother.
Now I'm filming everything around me, 1.5x zoom on the Vivo with a slightly wider angle, and on the Samsung S25 Ultra, shooting at 1x.
Even with the wide-angle mode enabled, the field of view on the Vivo still isn't as wide as on the Samsung, and the zoom levels are still quite different. And as for stabilization, nothing has changed with the Vivo here. It's neither better nor worse. Thanks to my daughter Mia for helping me shoot this test. Both smartphones deliver good image quality, but I'd give credit to Vivo for lighting up the face well, whereas on the Samsung it comes out pretty dark. Both smartphones handle running shots confidently, so let's move on.
1.5x zoom on the Vivo X200 Ultra. I widened the angle a little so that overall it would look better. In theory, filming should be better this way. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, this is the main lens at 1x. And basically, this is what the picture looks like if you film yourself like this.
When filming yourself, both smartphones produce a similar image, except that the Samsung's is more vibrant and has higher contrast. But of course, even with the wide angle, it's still uncomfortable to film yourself on the X200 Ultra. The shot ends up being way too close. It's hard to judge the stabilization result. On the Vivo, I cover almost the entire frame, so you can't really see the background. But to the eye, both smartphones performed quite smoothly. I also filmed everything around me with 2x zoom. Overall, the video looks similar here, and when walking, there's no noticeable difference in quality or stabilization. But when running, the Vivo outperformed its competitor. On the Samsung, the frame shakes more and there's noticeable blur.
So, friends, right now we're testing the sound recording quality in pretty challenging conditions. I'm standing here, and as you can see, the river is pretty loud.
In normal mode, both smartphones perform quite well. Even in challenging conditions, my voice is heard clearly on both the Vivo X200 Ultra and the Samsung S25 Ultra.
And now on the Vivo X200 Ultra, I've activated voice isolation. I haven't changed any settings on the Samsung. And this is how our voice recording sounds.
With voice enhancement enabled on the X200 Ultra, the sound becomes rather compressed and distorted, which, to be honest, doesn't sound very pleasant.
Alright, let's keep filming. Right now, I'm using the professional video recording mode on the Samsung S25 Ultra. You can immediately see how the dynamic range has dropped. The mountains in the background are no longer visible. In the professional video recording mode on the Samsung, I can choose the microphone direction. Right now, it's recording with the rear microphone. Now I'm switching to the front microphone, so you should be able to hear me as clearly as possible. I can see the voice monitoring. Unfortunately, on Vivo, you can't record with the front camera in Pro mode, while Samsung allows you to do that. That's really convenient. And now, let's lower the noise reduction and set it to strong. Now I've set the noise reduction to -12. So basically, all the background noise should be suppressed as much as possible, and you should only be able to hear me. And now I'm going to enable voice isolation on the Vivo X200 Ultra. I just enabled voice isolation. And now, I have the omnidirectional microphone recording on the Samsung. And on the Vivo, I'm using the regular voice video recording mode. And now I've activated voice enhancement. How do I sound now? Omnidirectional recording on the Samsung. Voice isolation on the Vivo. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Mic check. And on the Samsung, I've now set the noise reduction to -12. So basically, everything being recorded around me should now be minimized as much as possible. So how do I sound now? Is everything okay? 1, 2, 3. Mic check. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
I'm still really pleased that Samsung offers an option to select the microphone recording direction. This is an extremely convenient feature, and the voice is still heard quite well even when I turn on noise reduction. Samsung slightly lowers the overall volume, but it really does suppress background noise without overcompressing the sound and voice the way Vivo does. So, as always, I give Samsung a thumbs up for its audio recording.
Friends, now we're testing enhanced stabilization when we're shooting with an ultra-wide-angle lens. And as a result, our image starts to shake.
Overall, both ultra-wide cameras performed quite confidently in enhanced stabilization mode, even when shaking side to side. And here, I can't single out either one. The main lenses also did a very good job. I deliberately shook and rocked the smartphones quite a lot, and I think the result is pretty decent.
Friends, we're continuing to shoot the video portrait. On the Vivo, this is the ultra-wide lens, 4K at 30 frames per second. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, this is my main lens shooting in 4K at 30 frames per second.
Portrait video on both smartphones looks really good, but it's clear that because of the difference in focal lengths, the blur effect works differently. Both slightly blur my hair around the bangs when I film myself in profile, but otherwise, there aren't any noticeable issues along the blur border. However, sometimes the S25 Ultra loses focus. This problem becomes even more noticeable when running. Unfortunately, this problem with Samsung isn't new, and it still hasn't been fixed. With Vivo, everything looks great.
And on the Vivo, I've switched to the main lens 1.5x. Unfortunately, in video portrait mode, I can't crop the ultra-wide. On the Samsung, I'm continuing to shoot at 1x. This is basically the most practical focal length, intentionally chosen.
When shooting at 1.5x on the X200 Ultra, there are already spots where it loses focus, and combined with such a tight crop, this mode is basically unusable for filming yourself. When running, both smartphones show focus issues, so I wouldn't recommend shooting action in this mode on either Vivo or Samsung.
8K 30 FPS. Once again, filming everything around. How does our video look? Once again, there's an unbelievably huge waterfall over there.
Both 8K images look great. In terms of detail, you can't see any difference with the naked eye, but we'll check that more closely in the zoom test. There is a slight difference in color reproduction. The image on the left is darker and warmer, while the one on the right is brighter and cooler. As for stabilization, both smartphones performed quite similarly and pretty confidently.
Friends, this is what our video recording looks like. If you shoot with the ultra-wide-angle lens at 8K 30 FPS on both smartphones, how's the picture overall? Is everything okay? Right now, honestly, the conditions here are amazing, especially when the light is shining on you.
When filming yourself, the main difference is also in color reproduction. Samsung makes the image more saturated, including the skin, which ends up looking a bit orange. With Vivo, the skin tone comes out more yellowish. Overall, it's the same situation as when shooting in 4K. When running, the stabilization on the X200 Ultra handles it more confidently, while on the Samsung we again see background blur.
We're continuing to record right now. I switched the ultra-wide-angle lens, set it to 1x 4K 30 FPS on the Vivo. On my Samsung, I'm currently shooting an 8K 1x main lens 30 frames per second.
Unfortunately, friends, the Vivo doesn't have 8K video on the main camera, only on the ultra-wide. That's strange, because the X200 Pro did have 8K on the main lens. However, I can't say that there's any noticeable difference in quality between the left and right videos just by looking at them. And in terms of stabilization, the smartphones performed very similarly.
On the Vivo, I currently have it set to ultra-wide 1x. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, this is the main lens, shooting at 1x.
When filming yourself, of course, the 8K video on the right looks better. Samsung preserves facial details, fabric texture, hair, and stubble noticeably better. And when it comes to the stabilization test, both smartphones performed equally well, with no major shaking or jittering. When switching to the main lens on the Vivo, the difference in quality between the left and right videos seems to disappear. Both images are sharp and detailed, and the main difference here is just the framing. During the running test, the X200 Ultra performed a bit better, while the Samsung showed some slight blurring when the frame jerked.
And now we're shooting in 4K 30, recording at 1.5x. On the Samsung, we're shooting in 8K 1.5x.
Now, the main lens on the X200 Ultra and a 1.5x crop on the Samsung. And here, of course, the Vivo optics deliver higher quality. On the left, the detail and sharpness are noticeably higher, while on the S25 Ultra, the details are blurred, plus there are visible color distortions. Now for a difficult test, a fly-around shot of people. With the Vivo, we again see focusing issues, and they're serious. Almost half of the tracking shot with my daughter and me is blurry. Unfortunately, the Samsung also shows some out-of-focus moments, though not as frequent or severe as with the X200 Ultra. In the end, neither flagship managed to handle this test successfully.
Guys, there's a really cool feature that I really like on Samsung, the video mode, where I can film myself and everything around me at the same time. Basically doing a dual recording, what they call dual recording. You can see, there are some incredibly beautiful waterfalls ahead. So I'm filming and talking at the same time, showing and telling you what I see. This is definitely a really cool mode. And on Samsung, this mode records in 4K at 30 frames per second. Plus, there's a nice rounded frame, and you can even choose the direction. And what's convenient is that on Samsung, you can film yourself, and you can also do dual recording using the ultra-wide lens or the main lens.
And here's an example of using this kind of dual recording. It's really convenient to film yourself and show something interesting around you, like in this example with the vending machine. It's a useful feature if, for example, you run a blog. Let's dive into the macro world. With Vivo, the telephoto lens handles macro shots, and we can immediately see its advantage over Samsung's ultra-wide. Here, you can zoom in much more without almost any loss in image quality. With Samsung, as I mentioned, the ultra-wide lens is responsible for macro shooting, and throughout the entire video, you can see it struggling to focus. That's not surprising. You have to shoot from a very close distance, and it's almost impossible to keep the smartphone steady in your hands. That's why you get this kind of result. On the Vivo, the video also doesn't look very stabilized, so I always recommend shooting macro after securing the smartphones in place. Let's check how smoothly our smartphones switch between lenses. On the Vivo, all the transitions look very smooth, with no stuttering. The only thing I'll point out is a pretty noticeable change in white balance, especially when switching to the telephoto lens. On the S25 Ultra, the transitions are also quite seamless, but again, you can notice changes in white balance when switching lenses. However, I should note that on the Vivo, this difference is noticeably more pronounced. Let's move on to the video zoom test. And here, it's important to go over the camera specs. The X200 Ultra has a main camera with 50 megapixels and an f1.69 aperture, while the 200 megapixel periscope camera with an f2.27 aperture is responsible for the 3.7x optical zoom. The ultra-wide camera here is also 50 megapixels with an f2.0 aperture and a 116-degree field of view. The Samsung S25 Ultra has almost all the same cameras as the previous generation. The only new thing is the ultra-wide camera with 50 megapixels and a 120-degree field of view. The main camera is 200 megapixels, the 3x telephoto is 10 megapixels, and the 5x periscope is 50 megapixels. Now on to the test. With the ultra-wide lens, the results were very similar, and there's almost no difference in the details. At first glance, it seems like the Samsung has slightly sharper letter outlines, but the difference is minimal. We switched to the main lens on the S25 Ultra, and on the Vivo, we used the digital zoom on the ultra-wide at 1x and 2x. And of course, the optics here win hands down. Now, the main lens on the X200 Ultra and a 1.5x crop on the Samsung. And here, once again, the Vivo optics deliver higher quality. On the left, the detail and sharpness are noticeably higher, while on the S25 Ultra, the details are blurred. Plus, there are obvious color distortions here. 2.1x on the left, 2x on the right. Both digital zooms look similar, but the Samsung has slightly better sharpness. However, you can see color distortions in its details. Let's turn on the telephoto lenses on both smartphones. And here, of course, Vivo performs better, since it has a 3.7x lens with 200 megapixels, while Samsung only has a 10 megapixel lens. At 5x zoom, the S25 Ultra switches to its second telephoto lens. For Vivo, it's digital zoom, but the result still turns out to be extremely similar. When switching to 10x, we can see that Vivo has slightly sharper letters and less noise. I can say the same about the final close-up. Here too, the video on the left looks better. Now let's see if there's a difference between 4K and 8K shooting on our smartphones. On the Vivo, with the ultra-wide lens, 8K video definitely looks better than 4K. The text is clear and easy to read, whereas in 4K it's blurry. On the Samsung at 1x, 8K doesn't really offer any noticeable advantage. The videos look extremely similar. We also have the option to shoot in 8K on the 5x telephoto lens. And here, the video on the right really does look more confident. Fine text and details are sharper and more refined specifically in 8K. We're shooting slow motion video. Both smartphones support slow-mo in 4K at 120 frames per second, and the results end up being identical, whether you're using the ultra-wide or the main lenses. Also, on the main cameras, we have the option to shoot in full HD at 240 frames per second. And here, Vivo looks more interesting. It's noticeable that its video is processed more actively by algorithms, which makes the image look cleaner than on the Samsung. The nice optical blur is also a plus, which, unfortunately, is missing in the video on the right. Let's see how our smartphones perform in HDR and LOG shooting modes, and compare them to the standard dynamic range SDR. Let's start with the ultra-wide lens. In regular shooting, the Vivo X200 Ultra delivers a noticeably wider dynamic range. Sun glare is minimal on it, while the foreground remains bright and well-detailed. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, the sky is partially blown out, and the foreground looks darker. In terms of white balance, the image from the Vivo is warmer, while the Samsung's is more neutral. Switching to HDR mode doesn't change the situation with overexposure. Vivo once again confidently holds onto the bright areas, but the white balance becomes excessively warm. The whole scene shifts into yellow-orange tones, as if a Mexican filter from the TV series Breaking Bad has been applied. On the Samsung, the sky is blown out again, but in terms of color reproduction, the image looks more pleasant and balanced. We switch to a logarithmic profile, and for color grading, we use the official LUTs from the manufacturers. Here, things look really bleak. The sky is blown out on both, the foreground is dark, and the image lacks expression. We switch to the main lenses, and the same thing happens again. Vivo once again delivers excellent dynamic range, the sky is detailed, and the foreground is bright and sharp, but the color once again shifts toward yellow. With Samsung, it's the same story. The sky is partially overexposed, the foreground is dark, but the color reproduction remains more natural. In HDR mode, Vivo makes the image even brighter and again shifts it toward yellow. And with Samsung, the scene gets even darker, with more pronounced overexposure in the sky, but its color reproduction stays closer to reality. Let's move on to shooting in log mode. And here, too, there's no progress compared to the ultra-wide lens. The foreground is dark and the sky is overexposed. With the telephoto lenses, the situation changes. In SDR, Vivo's white balance becomes more neutral, while with Samsung, on the contrary, a warm tint appears. Overall, both shots are good in terms of quality, but Vivo's optical background blur looks great, and the foreground is also brighter, which makes the image appear more striking. In HDR, both shots become lighter and more washed out. With Vivo, the brightness is clearly overdone, and the color reproduction turned out unpleasant. With Samsung, the image looks very flat and is clearly lacking in depth. When switching to log profiles, we can see that overall, Vivo produces a pretty nice image that you can work with further. With Samsung, however, the video quality clearly drops, and the result overall doesn't look as interesting as with the X200 Ultra. Let's move on to the time-lapse test. Both smartphones can shoot these videos in 4K, but Vivo makes me happy with its greater flexibility and the presence of ready-made presets for different time-lapse scenarios. So what do we have in terms of results? With good lighting, both videos look great, with the only difference being in the white balance. But as soon as it gets dark, the S25 Ultra shows a noticeable drop in video quality, and the footage becomes much darker. With the Vivo, even in almost complete darkness, the video remains fairly well lit. That wraps up the video test. Let's move on to photos. Alright, let's see how the selfie cameras of both smartphones perform in photo mode. And right from the first shot with the front camera, the Samsung S25 Ultra shows noticeably greater depth of field. Not only the foreground, but also the background remains in focus. On the Vivo X200 Ultra, the background is softer with a slight blur. The color reproduction on the Samsung looks more natural. For example, on the Vivo, the color of my sweatshirt is rendered incorrectly. In reality, it's closer to blue, like in the photo on the right. I'll also point out the difference in skin tone. For instance, in the next selfie, you can clearly see that Vivo makes the skin a bit orange, while Samsung keeps a more natural skin tone. A selfie from the helicopter. Here again, the difference in color reproduction is noticeable. For example, on the Vivo, the color of my t-shirt turns turquoise. Samsung, on the other hand, preserved the color more accurately. Here's another photo with my lovely wife. The Vivo produced a brighter result, Otherwise, the difference in color reproduction is the same as I described earlier. The situation changes a bit with portrait selfies. In the very first photo, Samsung made the skin look more tanned and yellowish. Its saturation and brightness are clearly overdone. As for the blur, Samsung handled it quite carefully, whereas with Vivo you can see issues with the blur around my daughter's hair. But in the next photo, the questions are for Vivo. It feels like some kind of filter has been applied to the shot. The photo lacks contrast. The blues shift toward turquoise shades, and the skin turned out orange. With Samsung, the colors are closer to real life. In the next shot, Vivo made several serious mistakes with the blur. For example, it kept the roof of the house next to my mom's hand in focus. And with Samsung, my mom, who was standing between us, ended up partially out of focus. And this shot with a bright background is quite telling. In the photo on the right, my face looks pretty dark and not as expressive as Vivo shows it. Which one do you like more, friends? Whose result is better? Let me know in the comments. Here's another photo at the same location. And here, Vivo messed up the blur again. This time, it didn't blur out a whole chunk of the house by my shoulder. Other than that, here and in the next shot, the main differences are in the color reproduction. And we've already talked about that in detail above. Now let's take photos of people with the main camera module, for now without background blur. On the ultra-wide lens, the only difference is the colors. The photo on the left is warmer and darker. The result on the right is brighter and cooler. The main camera gives similar results in terms of color reproduction. As for detail, it's still hard to tell the difference. Let's move on to the telephoto lenses. 3 and 7 times zoom on the X200 Ultra and 3 times zoom on the Samsung. Here, Vivo delivers both higher image quality and more pleasant color reproduction. Samsung made the face way too orange. I'll also point out the optical blur in the photo on the left. That's a nice bonus you don't get with the Samsung. Next up is 7.4x digital zoom on the Vivo and 5x telephoto on the Samsung. Here, the photos are quite comparable in quality, but again, Vivo pleases with a nicer skin tone and background blur. At 10x zoom, we see that both smartphones really saturate the skin and push it toward an orange hue. As for photo quality, it's quite comparable here, but when zooming to 20x and 30x, Vivo clearly leads in terms of detail. Its algorithms enhance the shots more actively and with better quality. Although, when it comes to color accuracy, the S25 Ultra does a better job here. The second photo session is from the snowy Alps. Beneath our feet was a real glacier, and the altitude was almost 3,500 meters above sea level. My family and I were brought up here by helicopter. An unforgettable and a bit nerve-wracking experience, I have to say. We took a lot of photos to remember it by, but I didn't forget about the tests either, my friends. So give a like for the location. We're doing our best for you. Let's turn on portrait mode. On the Vivo, I set the blur to f2.8, and on the Samsung, the blur level is set to 5. Would you really be surprised if I told you that, once again, the photo taken with the Vivo looks more vibrant and colorful? I'll also note that I personally prefer the color reproduction in the shots on the left. Despite the yellowish tint, the faces come out well lit and not oversaturated, and thanks to the brighter foreground. The X200 Ultra does a better job of separating my daughter and me from the background. At the same time, the portraits on the Samsung look bland. They seem to lack depth and there's no emphasis on the foreground. Also, the skin tone here turned out a bit too red and dark in some areas. In the second photo session with my daughter Masha, once again, Vivo delivers much more expressive portraits at all zoom levels. That doesn't mean Samsung takes bad photos, it just does it in its own way. By the way, it's clear here that the S25 Ultra doesn't handle background blur as well. For example, at 3 and 5 times zoom, you can see mistakes between the neck and hair. Both smartphones have already gone through our favorite spoon and fork test in previous reviews, where we take portrait mode photos of thin objects like spoons and forks. But that was before. The smartphones have since received updates, and maybe the situation has changed. Unfortunately, Samsung still makes mistakes in this test, blurring the spoon in different areas. Vivo does a decent job at first, but at 5 and 9 times zoom, it also decides to blur the cutlery. And in these shots, Samsung really started acting up, leaving part of the house unblurred. At 3 times zoom, the situation only got worse, and only at 5 times zoom did it somewhat get its act together. But even there, it blurred part of the handle. In the end, Vivo definitely wins this test. Let's move on to the delicious food photos. Both smartphones have a dedicated food mode. Vivo offers 2 levels of zoom here, while Samsung has 3. In all the photos, you can see that the smartphones differ not only in color reproduction, but also in how they handle focusing. But overall, in both cases, the food itself looks great, just in different ways. Some people will prefer the brighter and more vibrant result from the X200 Ultra, while others might like the softer photo from the S25 Ultra. As they say, it's a matter of taste. Now, let's enjoy the cozy Swiss village by one of the tallest waterfalls in Europe even more, the Misty Waterfall, as the locals call it. Let's see what both gadgets' cameras can do in these conditions. The ultra-wide-angle lenses on the Vivo X200 Ultra and Samsung S25 Ultra deliver very similar results in terms of detail. It's practically a tie. The image is sharp, with minimal distortion for an ultra-wide lens. Overall, the photos turn out really great. The main differences, as always, are in the color grading. With Samsung, the sky and grass are often slightly tinted. Overall, the photos often look a bit cooler, with an emphasis on blue and green. But sometimes, especially in landscapes, this actually looks better. With Vivo, the tone is warmer, the overall saturation is a bit higher, but the photos still look natural. Additionally, I decided to check how Vivo would perform if I zoomed its ultra-wide lens to match Samsung's native focal length. And you know, it turns out pretty well for such a digital crop, especially for an ultra-wide lens. Yes, of course, the native 23mm of Samsung's main camera look better, but I wouldn't say it's by that much. Even Vivo's One X, which by default is done only through a digital crop from the ultra-wide camera, looks quite decent. I did the same thing, but the other way around. I tried to set up an alternative to Vivo's 35mm on the Samsung, and here, the situation is a bit worse. Basically, I'd recommend just stepping back a little and using the 3x on the Samsung if the distance doesn't allow you to take the shot with the main camera. The shot will definitely turn out better. At 2x zoom, the situation is the same for both, as Samsung zooms in on these 2x's with the main camera 1x and Vivo with 1 and 5x's. And this difference is very noticeable. The 3x zoom on the Samsung isn't bad on its own, but when you compare it to the almost 4x telephoto on the Vivo, it's clearly weaker. The S25 Ultra uses the same old sensor here that Samsung has been using since the S21 Ultra. But even so, I can't say that the photos from this Samsung telephoto are outright bad. And if you haven't had enough of these mesmerizing views, let's keep enjoying them by comparing photos in RAW format. RAW photos are unprocessed images taken by smartphones directly from the sensor without any post-processing. This allows you to edit them more flexibly on your own. Overall, I like the results from both smartphones. The original photos are of high enough quality that you can color grade them however you like. In some cases, the Samsung didn't manage to bring out the clouds as well as the Vivo did. This applies to both the ultra-wide and the main lens. At the same time, in these shots, the foreground is darker than on the X200 Ultra. So, on the Vivo, the dynamic range of RAW photos is actually wider than its competitors. We're testing macro photography. Samsung takes macro shots using the ultra-wide lens, which isn't very convenient because you constantly have to get as close as possible to the subject to take the shot. Vivo, on the other hand, usually uses the telephoto lens for this, which makes the process much easier. Still, the zoom presets are different on both devices. For example, in this shot, Vivo crops from the ultra-wide lens. Samsung also uses the ultra-wide lens for this. Here, both photos look good, but Samsung's result is more vibrant and has higher contrast, while the photo on the left looks a bit washed out. But Vivo has a superpower that we see in the next shot, its telephoto lens. With it, macro photos turn out very high quality and beautiful, allowing you to zoom in almost without any loss of quality. However, there's a catch. Because of the shallow depth of field, only a small part of the frame is in focus, while in the photos on the right, the entire flower is sharp. Overall, Samsung's results look pretty good, but you have to keep in mind that here I was able to bring the phone, and if you don't have that opportunity, the quality of the macro shots will be significantly worse. Now let's see how smartphones handle long exposure shots. On all Vivo phones, taking such photos is very convenient, and the X200 Ultra is no exception. Right in the camera app, you select the necessary presets and get stunning results. With Samsung, though, it's always a hassle. You have to turn on Expert RAW, manually set the exposure time, adjust the exposure, and add an ND filter to avoid overexposure. And all of that is for a result that, in 90% of cases, is worse than all the competitors we've compared the smartphone and its previous generations to. And this time, too, the shots from the S25 Ultra turned out not very good, to put it mildly. And to actually take really good photos with the S25 Ultra in Expert RAW using a long exposure, you absolutely have to use a tripod. Friends, let's quickly go over the other photo shooting modes: burst, instant, and live photo. I've already shown these 3 modes in other in-depth videos about our flagships, so I don't see any point in repeating myself. I'll just mention here that both burst and instant photo modes work similarly on Vivo and Samsung. In burst mode, both are limited to 100 shots and generally deliver good results. Instant photo on Vivo doesn't always work precisely or reliably. On Samsung, however, these shots always looked great in our tests. As for live photo on Vivo, it's basically a mini video, while on Samsung it's more like the live photo feature on the iPhone. Here, it's called animated photo. You can loop it or slow it down, which is actually a pretty cool feature. We should also say a few words about the creative shooting modes. And here, of course, Samsung looks very limited compared to its Chinese competitor. The S25 Ultra basically just has a set of filters. And among the more interesting options, there's AI object fill-in on photos, which, to be fair, works really well. Vivo, on the other hand, offers a huge number of AI filters that let you create these kinds of unique photos. All in all, you can really let your imagination run wild with the camera here. Karamzin, Gerda, and Byron all spoke about this beautiful Staubach waterfall. Now it's our turn, but only in the context of comparing the zoom range of our smartphones in photo mode. At 0.6x zoom, the image looks pretty much the same for us. There's no noticeable difference in photo quality, either overall or in the details. At 1.5x zoom, the Vivo is clearly sharper than the Samsung at 1x. However, even in the S25 Ultra photo, we can still read the small text. Vivo just wins here thanks to its longer focal length. The 3.7x telephoto performs more confidently here than the 3x, although the difference in favor of Vivo is really minor. At 5x zoom, we get a pretty comparable result, and the text is about equally readable on both the left and right. But when we switch to 7.4x on the Vivo, we get a noticeably sharper result than at 5x on the Samsung. At 10x on the Vivo, the algorithms kick in more aggressively, making the image look sharper and allowing small text to be read better than in the photo on the right. At higher zoom levels, the situation gets more complicated. Both smartphones heavily use image enhancement algorithms, but the final result on the Vivo turns out just a bit sharper. At the same time, small inscriptions on both smartphones turn into lines with dots or into some symbols unknown to science. Here, I can only point out that the maximum zoom on the Vivo is 105x, while on the Samsung it's 100x. Although the difference is minor and not even noticeable to the naked eye. So, what's next? It's gotten dark, friends, and we're moving on to low-light tests. For that, we're heading from the Swiss village to the city of Bern, because it's just impossible to shoot outside the city with so little light. There's basically no street lighting here at all. Actually, I should mention separately that it's generally difficult to shoot evening tests in European cities, whether it's Denmark, Sweden, or Switzerland. Even in big cities, the lighting is very weak. Here, they don't even really light up the landmarks, just to save electricity. Because of this, I had to wander around the city until 3 in the morning looking for at least some decent sources of light. So, friends, please support this video with a like for all my efforts.
Friends, as usual, our first test is the front camera shoots 4K at 30 frames per second.
You can see that Vivo highlights the face more actively, regardless of the lighting in the frame, while Samsung's image turns out darker. However, Samsung has a more accurate skin tone, whereas the X200 Ultra shifts the skin tone towards yellow. In terms of detail, at first glance, the video from the S25 Ultra looks a bit more refined. Let's look at the facial details, eyes, wrinkles, and hair. On the right, all of this is easier to see. When it comes to stabilization, both front cameras performed equally poorly. The background shakes a lot, both on the left and on the right.
Friends, this is how the video portrait mode works. This is with the background blur effect. When we're shooting full HD on the Vivo X200 Ultra, and 4K at 30 frames per second on the Samsung S25 Ultra.
Of course, when there's not enough light, I definitely wouldn't recommend shooting in portrait mode with the front cameras. The videos became noisier and even less detailed. But surprisingly, the background blur holds up pretty well. Although, what's the point of that if the image quality is so poor? The main difference here is in the color. The Vivo video looks kind of green with an orange skin tone. Samsung's image is warmer, and the skin tone looks more natural. With a good light source, the video looks better, actually quite acceptable. But even then, the same color difference remains. Stabilization here is just as bad as in a regular mode. So let's not even dwell on that.
4K at 30 frames per second, filming everything around on the ultra-wide-angle lens.
When shooting everything around with the ultra-wide lens, the X200 Ultra gives us a higher quality result with better handling of light sources. With the Samsung, everything looks worse. The streetlights, for example, the tree, and the building in front. The stabilization on the Vivo X200 Ultra works pretty well. With the Samsung, though, we see shaking and blur with every step.
This is what the picture looks like here, when basically, at least I have some lights illuminating me. These are ultra-wide-angle lenses. Both smartphones are shooting 4K at 30 frames per second.
When filming yourself, once again Vivo clearly outperforms its competitors in terms of image quality. The texture of the clothing and facial details are preserved better on the X200 Ultra. However, both flagships have issues with skin tones. With the Vivo, the skin tone is yellowish, while on the S25 Ultra it has a reddish-orange tint. Vivo also handled stabilization more confidently, whereas with the Samsung, the background is noticeably blurred.
Alright, and now we're shooting at 1x on both smartphones. Alright, let's keep filming. I'm walking down the street, trying, as I said, to find the most well-lit spot.
At 1x, Samsung gives a brighter image but once again handles light sources worse. With Vivo, 1x is actually a crop from the ultra-wide lens, and interestingly, the image is almost on par with the main lens of the S25 Ultra. In terms of stabilization, the X200 Ultra performed just as well as its competitor. In fact, Samsung's result turned out to be even a bit weaker. For example, you can see the sign in front is noticeably blurred on it.
Guys, this is what the footage looks like if you shoot on the Vivo X200 Ultra at 1x, which is actually a crop from the ultra-wide lens. On the Samsung, this is just the 1x lens, and this is what the footage looks like if you film yourself in 4K at 30 frames per second.
When shooting myself, we can clearly see the Samsung S25 Ultra has the advantage in image quality. With Vivo, the image turns out more blurred and less sharp. Just look at the texture of the clothing or the details of the face. Both smartphones struggled with skin tone. Vivo's is yellowish, while Samsung's is a deep orange. Although, it's important to consider the color of the lighting around me here. In the stabilization test, both flagships performed really well. Once again, the crop from the ultra-wide on the Vivo surprised me.
Now on the Vivo, I've also switched to the main lens, that's 1.5x, and on the Samsung, we're shooting at 1x.
When shooting everything around with the main lens, the image quality on the Vivo noticeably improved. Now, both flagship smartphones give us a good result. The main difference is exposure. Samsung's video is brighter than that of the X200 Ultra. There's also a slight difference in white balance. The stabilization on the Vivo at 1.5x doesn't work very well. The image noticeably shakes with every step. Samsung's video looks more stable.
We're still filming everything around us. Now on the Vivo, I've widened the frame a bit to get a slightly wider angle. On the Samsung, I'm continuing to shoot at 1x 4K, 30 frames per second.
With a wider angle, Vivo still delivers a result similar to Samsung. The picture looks good, but again there are stabilization issues, shaking with every step.
And on the Vivo, I've now turned off the extension on the main lens. The extension of the 35mm, let's say, the main camera module. On the Samsung, I'm still filming at 1x 4K, 30 frames per second, 1x filming myself.
To judge the difference in video quality here, the Vivo has too much crop, so you can't even fit your whole head in the frame. The most noticeable difference is in color reproduction. The X200 Ultra's image is paler and darker, while the one on the right is brighter and more vibrant. When there's less light in the frame, Vivo tries to brighten the face more, but as a result, the image becomes unusable. With Samsung, on the other hand, it's too dark and also looks weak. Shooting with smartphones in these conditions is not the best idea.
Guys, this is what shooting on the Vivo X200 Ultra looks like. If I film with the main lens, which is 35mm, with the angle of view slightly widened. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, I'm shooting at 1x. This is the kind of picture we get.
With the wide angle on the Vivo, the picture looks a bit better. The shot isn't as close up anymore, but otherwise, nothing has changed. Even in these conditions, both smartphones handled stabilization pretty well. When filming two people, the smartphones deliver very similar quality results. The image is a bit noisy on both flagships, but Samsung's video is a little less sharp, and you can even notice some blur while moving. In the stabilization test, both smartphones performed uncertainly, and we ended up with footage that was quite shaky.
Friends, this is what shooting a video portrait with background blur effect looks like on the Vivo X200 Ultra. Right now, I have the ultra-wide lens turned on. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, it's at 1x, so it's convenient shooting with a background blur effect.
Unfortunately, Vivo loses focus again in portrait mode. And it happens constantly. Samsung handles the situation better. It doesn't have these focusing issues. However, I really don't like its overly saturated orange skin tone. Although, again, in these conditions, skin color depends a lot on the lighting. Both flagships handle stabilization quite well, but unfortunately, Vivo still couldn't lock onto my face and catch focus here either.
So here we're filming in really good conditions at 1.5x on the Vivo X200 Ultra. Well, probably only half of my head will fit in the frame. On the Samsung, it's 1x, everything's fine, but on the Vivo, the blur is at f2.8, while on the Samsung, it's at f1.0.
On the main lens, the result from the X200 Ultra already looks better. So far, it doesn't have these defocusing issues. The main difference here, aside from the framing, is the skin tone. But I won't repeat myself about that anymore. As for stabilization, both smartphones perform quite well here.
Now we're shooting at 8K 30 frames per second with the ultra-wide-angle lens. We have such a beautiful location here. The temple is beautifully lit up.
Well, friends, you can see for yourselves here that the picture from the Samsung doesn't even come close to the results on the Vivo. Everything is blurry, noisy, and dark. At the same time, the video on the X200 Ultra looks quite acceptable. In terms of stabilization, it also performs better than its competitor, while on the Samsung we see frame smearing.
4K at 30 frames per second, 1x zoom, meaning from the main lens on the X200 Ultra, 8K, 30 frames per second. Filming is done with the main lens of the Samsung S25 Ultra.
When shooting with a single X, the smartphones give us generally similar images, and there's really no visible advantage for the 8K here. But the Samsung has slightly higher exposure, which, for example, causes the storefront on the right to be overexposed. In terms of stabilization, both smartphones don't perform very confidently. On the X200 Ultra, the image shakes, while on the S25 Ultra, it wobbles from side to side.
And we keep testing. Right now, I've switched to 1.5x, slightly widening the angle on the Vivo X200 Ultra. We're shooting in 4K at 30 frames per second. And on the Samsung S25 Ultra, 8K, 30 frames per second, continuing, shooting at 1x.
When shooting with the main lens on the Vivo, its 4K image looks significantly better than the 8K on the S25 Ultra. The video on the left is brighter, sharper, and more detailed. In the stabilization test, the X200 Ultra also performs noticeably better. On the Samsung, the whole image wobbles.
Friends, this is what 1.5x looks like in 4K at 30 frames per second on the Vivo X200 Ultra, when I widen the angle a bit. And accordingly, the Samsung S25 Ultra, 8K, 30 frames per second when there is plenty of light.
When shooting yourself, the 8K video also doesn't really give us any particular advantage. Moreover, in low light conditions, the image on the S25 Ultra turns out much darker than on the Vivo. The X200 Ultra even tries to brighten up your face in such conditions, which definitely earns my thumbs up. In the stabilization test, both smartphones show decent results and remain quite steady. Without the wide-angle lens, nothing really changes in terms of video quality or stabilization, so I don't see any point in dwelling on this test. Let's move on to panning around a person. The X200 Ultra has the same issue again, it loses focus. With the Samsung, there are only occasional blurs, but overall, it holds focus more confidently. Let's move on to the video zoom test. When shooting with the ultra-wide lens, the Vivo X200 Ultra handles light sources better. For example, with this sign. On the Samsung, though, it's overexposed, even though the text on both the left and right is still quite readable. For some reason, the S25 Ultra at 1x wouldn't focus at all, so unfortunately, we can't compare the detail here. Let's look at 1.5 times zoom. The smartphones deliver similar results in terms of detail, but the Samsung has noticeably more noise. At 2 times zoom, the results are also quite similar, but the text is a bit easier to read on the Samsung, while it's harder to make out on the Vivo. Telephoto lenses, 3 and 7 times zoom on the Vivo, and 3 times zoom on the Samsung. And the X200 Ultra produces a more detailed image with less noise. The large text, of course, is clearly visible on the Samsung as well, but the smaller text is completely blurred. At 5 times zoom, despite the digital zoom on the Vivo, both flagships perform identically. I can say the same about the 10 times zoom. The maximum zoom is 30 times on the Vivo and 20 times on the Samsung. On the left, we have a bit more noise, and don't pay attention to the overexposure, it was out of focus, but after I tapped on the sign on the screen, the Vivo immediately adjusted and corrected the exposure. Otherwise, the Vivo looks very similar, with no clear advantage for either side. Let's see if there's any point in using 8K at night. And here I can say for sure, on the ultra-wide, definitely not. Neither the Vivo nor the Samsung saw any improvement with 8K at all. In fact, the overexposure actually got worse. Let's switch to 1.5x zoom on the S25 Ultra. And here you can really see that 8K video looks better in terms of detail, even if it's not by much. The text became sharper, and there's less noise. Now let's see how smartphones handle selfie photos in low light. The difference is noticeable in the very first photo. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, the photo is much darker because the Vivo X200 Ultra uses the screen to light up the face. Because of this, the photo on the left has a bit more detail, but it looks overexposed and lacks contrast. Next is my photo with my daughter. The main difference here is in the skin tone. On the Vivo, it looks unnaturally yellow, while Samsung gives a more natural shade. In the third photo, you can see the difference in skin tone. On the Vivo, the skin color is slightly yellowish, while on the Samsung, it's pink. There's also a noticeable difference in color reproduction here. On the S25 Ultra, the image looks more vibrant. Let's look at the fourth photo. The image on the Samsung is clearly much darker. At the same time, the sharpness of the image is also noticeably lost. Let's move on to portrait selfies. The shot from the S25 Ultra is still just as dark. On the X200 Ultra, the image is brighter, but it has a noticeable yellow tint. Both smartphones handle the background blur neatly. It looks good. We're taking photos of people with the main camera module. With the ultra-wide lens, we can see a difference in color reproduction. On the Vivo, the image clearly has a yellow tint, and the skin tone looks orange. At 1x and 1.5x zoom on the Vivo, it's the same story. On the Samsung, the shot has more natural color reproduction, but it's less sharp. Let's look at 3x zoom on the Vivo and 3.7x on the Samsung. The X200 Ultra once again gives us an orange skin tone. On the Samsung, the image is darker and also less sharp and detailed. The S25 Ultra also shows noticeable noise. Next up is 5x zoom. On the Vivo, it looks like there's some kind of yellow filter over the photo. On the Samsung, the image is once again darker, with noise and less sharpness. Let's move on to 10x zoom. The color reproduction on the Vivo is still the same, but the detail is noticeably higher than on the Samsung. On the S25 Ultra, you can see noise again, and the image itself is clearly darker once more. And now, let's test 20x zoom. On the Samsung, it looks like there's a turquoise filter over the photo. The sharpness and detail on the Vivo are clearly higher. Let's move on to a photo shoot with my daughter Maya. Right away, I'll point out that when comparing the shots, the issue with skin tone really stands out. On the Vivo, the skin has overly warm tones. Sometimes it looks orange, sometimes red. Samsung, on the other hand, keeps a more natural skin tone, but when you zoom in a lot, a slight redness appears. The S25 Ultra loses out in terms of detail, especially at high zoom levels, and the face gets heavily smoothed, which causes the image to lose sharpness. To sum it up briefly, in standard shooting mode, Samsung usually delivers more accurate color correction for people, but the facial detail leaves much to be desired, especially at high zoom levels. There are also issues with noise, and the photos also turn out quite dark. With Vivo, on the other hand, the shots are brighter, have less noise, and higher detail, but the skin tone and overall color reproduction are more of an acquired taste. It's time to test portraits on the main camera module in low light conditions. Let's look at 1.5x on the Vivo and 1x on the Samsung. The shots turned out very similar, with only a slight difference in skin tone noticeable. On the Vivo, it has a slightly orange tint, while on the Samsung it looks quite natural. 2.2x zoom on the Vivo and 2x zoom on the Samsung. The S25 Ultra really surprised me here. What is going on with the skin tone? It's bright yellow. Now let's look at 3.7x on the Vivo and 3x on the Samsung. The image on the X200 Ultra is more saturated, which makes the skin tone shift toward an orange tint. And even on the Samsung, the skin looks a bit orange too. Moving on to 5.9x on the Vivo and 5x on the Samsung. The skin tone situation stays the same as in the previous close-ups. The image itself is a bit sharper on the Vivo. The background blur at all zoom levels was impressive. I didn't notice any major mistakes. Everything looks quite neat and beautiful. Now let's take a look at photos of Anya and Maya together. We'll start with 1.5x on the Vivo and 1x on the Samsung. Once again, the S25 Ultra's image is less sharp and even has some noise. 2.2x on the Vivo and 2x on the Samsung. The pictures are very similar. The only thing to point out, a slight difference in color reproduction. Let's move to 3.7x on Vivo and 3x on Samsung. Here, the same difference in frame saturation remains. You can also see noise on the Samsung. Both smartphones show some flaws along the blur boundary, especially if you look at the hair. 5.9x on the Vivo and 5x on the Samsung. The shots are quite similar, but the photo from the Samsung is a bit darker. In the end, I can say that with a good light source, both smartphones deliver roughly the same result. But as soon as you move away from the light, the difference becomes obvious. Vivo brightens up faces, and overall the picture looks nicer. With the Samsung, the shot becomes too dark, and the skin tone shifts to unnatural shades. That's why, for portrait photography in these conditions, Vivo delivers a much more stable and higher quality result. Let's move on to the landscape photos. At the same time, I suggest you admire the local architecture. For example, this beautiful building is the Bern Cathedral, the main local Gothic landmark. By the way, its tower is the tallest in the country. And this is the Widman Fountain, built in 1844. It's a very atmospheric place, especially at night. Massive columns, a bronze figure inside, and a quiet square all around. As for the photos themselves, I like the results from both ultra-wide cameras, switching to 1x zoom. In the frame, we have the famous Ziklag clock tower, which was built back in the 13th century. At 1.5x zoom, both smartphones once again give us good results. The shots come out sharp, with pleasant color reproduction and good detail. Now let's see how the telephoto lenses perform, 3.7x on the Vivo and 3x on the Samsung. Both smartphones deliver excellent results, sharp images with high detail. There's only a slight difference in color reproduction, but it's not significant. The photos turn out really awesome. Let's move on to shooting in RAW. With Vivo, the original files turn out brighter and lighter by default compared to Samsung. Unfortunately, on the S25 Ultra, the dark areas in many shots from any lens were lost, and it wasn't possible to recover them in post-processing. Any attempt to do so results in the photo becoming overexposed, with a lot of noise and artifacts appearing. The situation with light sources is also worse on the Samsung. They are more overexposed, and it wasn't possible to completely fix these blown highlights. With Vivo, the photos often turn out too bright, which makes the noise and artifacts in the shadows more noticeable, and the images themselves seem to lack depth and contrast. But with this kind of file, you have more flexibility to work with it and give it a more interesting look. Let's move on to the photo zoom test in low light conditions. When shooting with the ultra-wide lens, the smartphones deliver identical results. The text is readable in both photos, but it's worth noting that the sign is less overexposed on the Vivo. With the main lens, we also got almost identical shots in terms of detail. Once again, the text can't be read in either photo. One at 5x zoom on the Vivo and one at 6x zoom on the Samsung. The Vivo performs much better here. First, the sharpness is noticeably higher. Second, the yellow text on the Vivo is easy to read, while on the Samsung it's completely blurred. Now let's look at 2.2x zoom on the Vivo and 2x zoom on the Samsung. Here, the superiority of the Chinese flagship is obvious. The text is sharp, all the labels are perfectly readable. Samsung can't boast the same, and instead of text, we just see a blurry mess. Let's move on to comparing the telephoto lenses, 3.7x on the Vivo and 3x on the Samsung. And again, we see that the quality on the Vivo is much higher. Let's check out the 5x zoom. The level of detail on both smartphones is about the same. You can't read the text anywhere. 7.4x on the Vivo and 7.6x on the Samsung. Both flagships perform similarly. There are some slight blurs in certain areas on both photos. Now let's move on to the 10x zoom. The Vivo X200 Ultra has noticeably higher sharpness, and the text is much easier to make out. At 30x zoom, Vivo also performed better. The writing, while not perfect, is still readable, whereas on the Samsung it's just a blurry mess. At 60x zoom, as you can see, the situation is pretty much the same. And at 105x zoom, it's the same story. Vivo performs better, delivering a sharper image. Let me say a few words about shooting the night sky. On Vivo, the astrophotography mode is implemented very conveniently, but what's disappointing is that there's no AR planetarium here, which I personally really liked in the X200 Pro. It's strange that such features were removed from the Ultra flagship. As for standard astrophotography, Vivo produces less noise, more stars scattered across the sky, and as a result, the photo turns out more interesting. Now, let's move on to shooting the moon. With Vivo, it appears almost immediately and becomes clearer and more detailed as the zoom increases. With Samsung, on the first levels of zoom, the moon just looks like a lit-up circle. You can only really see it at 30x zoom. At higher zoom levels, overall, both smartphones handle it well. And the main difference here is just in the color reproduction. Now let's upload the photos to Instagram. And here we have the usual situation. The social network, as always, adds extra color to all the photos, whether they're from Vivo or Samsung. Keep this in mind if you're posting your photos on Instagram. So, what about the batteries? The Vivo X200 Ultra is equipped with a 6000 mAh battery. It uses silicon-carbon technology, which allows for increased capacity while keeping the size compact. Thanks to the silicon-carbon anode, it also improves cold resistance and increases charging speed. The smartphone supports fast wired charging at 90 watts, as well as wireless charging at 40 watts. A nice bonus is the presence of reverse charging at 4.5 watts. The Samsung S25 Ultra, on the other hand, comes with a 5000 mAh battery using traditional lithium-ion technology. It supports wired charging at 45 watts and wireless charging at 15 watts. It also has reverse charging at 4.5 watts. After a very active first day of shooting, the Vivo finished with 19% battery remaining. The Samsung, on the other hand, was down to 12%. By the end of the next day, however, it was the opposite. The X200 Ultra lagged behind the Samsung, with 47% versus 49%. Here's another important point about shooting time-lapse. When recording them, the Vivo screen turns off completely, leaving only a message in the battery level displayed, while on the Samsung, the screen just dims but doesn't turn off entirely, which causes the battery to drain faster. Let's talk about the screens. The Vivo X200 Ultra has an LTPO AMOLED display with a diagonal of 6.82 inches and a resolution of 3168 by 1440 pixels. The screen supports an adaptive refresh rate from 1 to 120 Hz. The Samsung S25 Ultra is equipped with a dynamic LTPO AMOLED 2X display with a slightly larger diagonal, 6.9 inches, and a resolution of 3120 by 1440 pixels. Just like the Vivo, the refresh rate here is dynamic, ranging from 1 to 120 Hz. Let's measure the PWM frequency on both smartphones. At maximum brightness, the X200 Ultra shows about 10%, while the S25 Ultra delivers 36.5%. At half brightness, the X200 Ultra registers values within 8 to 9%, whereas the S25 Ultra remains at 36%. At 15% brightness, the X200 Ultra is recorded at around 10%, while the S25 Ultra reaches 67.5%. At minimum brightness, the X200 Ultra stays at about 5%, whereas the S25 Ultra is at 32 to 33%. Therefore, if you are sensitive to PWM, using Samsung screens at minimum brightness won't be very comfortable. Here, I also measured the maximum brightness of the screens. The Vivo reached 214 nits, while the Samsung got 198. So how do they perform? Both smartphones are equipped with Snapdragon 8 Elite, the latest and most powerful Qualcomm chip available today. Paired with it is the powerful Adreno 830 graphics accelerator. This combination delivers lightning-fast performance in every scenario, from demanding mobile games to complex photo and video processing. Users of both devices can expect a high-quality experience without any lags or freezes. Let's run some benchmarks. In the Antutu test, the X200 Ultra not only finished faster than the S25 Ultra, but also scored significantly higher than its competitor. Now, let's run the Geekbench test. Vivo completed this test faster as well, earning a higher score in the single-core benchmark. However, in the multi-core test, it lost to the S25 Ultra. The X200 Ultra also performed faster in the GPU test, once again scoring higher. The final test is 3D Mark, where we look at the smartphone stability under prolonged loads and their heat generation. In the end, the Vivo proved to be more stable, 49% stability compared to 40% for the S25 Ultra. However, the temperature of the X200 Ultra reached 50 degrees Celsius, which was quite hot, while the Samsung only heated up to 43 degrees. Now we're testing the network speed and starting the Wi-Fi measurement. In the first test, the X200 Ultra showed a download speed of 703 megabits per second and an upload speed of 414 megabits. The S25 Ultra, on the other hand, demonstrated a very weak download speed, about 62 megabits, but showed an upload speed of 481 megabits. In the second test, after switching the server on the S25 Ultra, the download and upload speeds increased to 667 and 816 megabits, respectively. Meanwhile, the Vivo showed 896 megabits and 543 megabits here. Overall, we can clearly see here that the Chinese smartphone performs excellently in European Wi-Fi networks. I also tested the mobile internet speed on both smartphones under the same conditions. 5G network, the same Spanish carrier. The Vivo X200 Ultra achieved a download speed of 111 megabits per second. Upload speed was almost 67 megabits. The Samsung S25 Ultra showed weaker results, about 94 megabits for download and 33.5 megabits for upload. The Vivo performed more confidently this time, even though it had shown rather weak results in previous tests. Friends, we've already discussed the smart features in smartphones in detail in our first major reviews of these flagships. Here, I'll briefly go over the main points. Since I have the Chinese version of the Vivo, all the local AI features are tailored for the Chinese market and simply won't work in other countries. Samsung actually has a lot of AI features, and they work great. Here you have real-time call translation, AI features for managing notes, SMS, and the system as a whole, and much more. If you want to see all these features in action, there will be a link to the Samsung S25 Ultra review in the description. So, for any user outside of China, Samsung offers way more AI features than Vivo.
Friends, let's check how our smartphones perform in terms of sound and visuals. First up, we have the Vivo X200 Ultra. Let's take a look at the video quality now and, accordingly, see how the speakers work. Let's go! Alright, we'll start at the lowest volume and gradually turn it up. Right now, it's at medium volume. Well, the colors are definitely awesome. The Vivo screen really performs well. The sound is coming from right here and from under the screen. Now let's turn it up to the maximum volume. Now let's listen to how it sounds on the Samsung. Alright, let's also turn up the volume here. Right now it's at mid-volume, but again, the Samsung screen looks absolutely fantastic. The sound here is coming from this spot. I'm even covering it right now. And somewhere under the screen as well. Now let's set it to maximum volume. So friends, what can I say? Both Samsung and Vivo obviously have great screens, but maybe the Samsung is a bit brighter, with a screen that's a little more contrasty. But when it comes to sound, I think the Samsung might be just a little bit quieter, but its body doesn't rattle. Whereas here, with the Vivo, the body does rattle a little bit.
The Vivo X200 Ultra in the Chinese version cost me $1,399. As for the Samsung, I got it for €1,421. Both versions have 1 terabyte of storage, so the difference in price is pretty small in the end. So which one should you choose? Let's figure it out. The first thing that's important to mention is what's included in the box. Vivo really impressed me here, of course. In the box, we get a fast charger and a branded, high-quality case. Whereas with the Samsung, there's only a charging cable, not even a power adapter. That's already a point in Vivo's favor. So, let's start with its advantages. First of all, it has an excellent ultra-wide camera that performs confidently both during the day and at night. Even when cropping up to 1x, the result was still quite solid and high quality. Special props for the telephoto lens. It's a whole level above both telephoto lenses on Samsung in terms of zoom quality, portrait shots, and macro photography. By the way, when it comes to macro, Vivo generally does a better job with both photos and videos. I also want to highlight the much cooler Timelapse, where you can choose from ready-made presets, and the result turns out more interesting and higher quality than on Samsung. Portrait photos are another strong point of the X200 Ultra. There are more focal lengths here and higher quality, especially with high digital zooms. I should also mention the convenient implementation of the long exposure mode. You just take out your phone, pick a preset, snap a photo, and get an awesome shot. No hassle with manually setting the exposure or a bunch of other parameters. The SRAW mode on Vivo also impressed me. Overall, it gives you more room for editing, and the final results have a wider dynamic range. On top of that, there are noticeably more creative modes and filters here, and they're more interesting than what the Korean competitor offers. The smartphone also turned out to be more powerful in most tests, and its screen is brighter with less PWM flicker. The Samsung S25 Ultra mainly stands out because it's released for the global market. This is a smartphone that is ready to work right away without Chinese software, with eSIM support, all Google services, and built-in Gemini. Everything works straight out of the box. And here, it's important to say a few words about just how convenient it is to have eSIM. When my family and I went to Switzerland, I encountered roaming issues for the first time. My Spanish SIM card, which gave me 50 gigabytes of internet throughout the entire European Union, switched to roaming mode in Switzerland. The carrier charged me €10 and gave me 600 megabytes for the day. And it was the same every day. That's when I realized how inconvenient it was that my main smartphone is a Chinese Huawei-made XT Ultimate design without eSIM. By the way, we also did a review of it, which we filmed right on the Great Wall of China. If you haven't seen it, you definitely should check it out. So, I had to take out my iPhone, quickly set up an eSIM, and use the internet through it without roaming. That's why, of course, the global version with eSIM support is a must-have for traveling. In this regard, Samsung is honestly much more convenient. When it comes to video from the front camera, it's also clearly ahead. The stabilization is better, the detail is higher, including in portrait mode. Audio recording is another definite advantage for Samsung. Less distortion, more advanced noise reduction, and the ability to choose the microphone direction in Pro mode. Skin tones look more natural and consistent in most scenes, which can also be a plus for users who want more natural-looking photos and videos. What else is important and convenient? Samsung gives us more familiar focal lengths both in photo mode and when shooting video. Portrait video on the main camera also performed a bit better, not perfect, but still the result is much more stable than on the Vivo. I also liked how live photo is implemented. There are more settings here, including looping and slow motion. And let's not forget about AI object fill, a feature that really works. Plus, under heavy load, the S25 Ultra heats up noticeably less than the Vivo X200 Ultra. So if you're interested in getting the most out of photography, advanced modes, and a top-tier telephoto lens, then your choice should be the Vivo X200 Ultra. But if you need a smartphone with more reliable video recording, a stable and high-quality front camera, and a fully featured global firmware, then go for the Samsung S25 Ultra. Something like that, friends. That's all for now. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and goodbye everyone.